My name is Helen. I'm 42, born and raised in Oregon, and for the past 12 years, I've been married to Mark, a civil engineer who, at the moment, lives out of a suitcase somewhere in Brussels. He left 2 years ago for what was supposed to be a 6-month contract. Every few months, the company just needs him a little longer. I've stopped asking when he's coming back. Our house is one of those 2-story places that looks calm from the outside. Trimmed lawn, fresh paint, the kind of place people describe as stable. Inside, it's me, our dog Daisy, and a quiet that's become too routine. Most nights I work late at the design firm, microwave dinner, then answer Mark's video calls with a practiced smile. He tells me about meetings, new coffee spots, the rain in Brussels. I nod, say I'm proud of him, and keep my eyes away from the empty chair at our table. He jokes that distance keeps us interesting. I joke back that it saves us money on date nights. We laugh because that's what couples do when honesty would only make things worse. But after the call, I stare at the stack of bills on the counter: car loan, property tax, Daisy's vet visits. My salary covers most of it, but not comfortably. The savings account we used to call future plans now covers groceries and gas. One night, after scrolling through our online banking app, I realized I was chewing the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood. Something had to change. I wasn't desperate. Not yet, but I could feel that fine line approaching. Around 2 a.m, I made myself a cup of coffee and stared up at the ceiling. The upstairs floor, 2 rooms, a bathroom, small kitchenette, had been sitting empty since Mark left. We used to talk about turning it into a guest suite. Now it was just another space filled with dust and silence. By morning, I'd made a decision. I'd rent it out, month to month, nothing long term, just until the contract ended, or until I felt like myself again. I cleaned for 2 days straight, changed the linens, fixed the light bulbs, even patched the crack in the bathroom mirror with clear epoxy. Daisy followed me from room to room, confused by the sudden order. I opened the windows to let in the March air. Damp, clean, a little raw. It smelled like a reset. That night, I listed the space online. Quiet furnished unit. No smoking. Ideal for professionals. Month to month. No drama. The words looked sterile, but maybe that was what I needed. Predictable. Simple. When Mark called later that night, I didn't mention it. He sounded tired but cheerful, talking about a restaurant his coworkers had taken him to. "You'd love it," he said. "They make pasta from scratch." I smiled. "Sounds perfect." "You should visit, Helen. Seriously this time." "I can't," I said quickly. "Work's insane." He hesitated. "We'll figure it out." After we hung up, I looked around the kitchen. The half-empty wine bottle, the unpaid bill under the fruit bowl, the light flickering above the sink. Everything looked fine, normal. But as I stood there, barefoot on the cold tile, I knew it wasn't fine at all. Stability can rot quietly, like wood beneath a perfect coat of paint. The next morning, I got my first message about the listing. A man named Ethan, 31, delivery driver, needed a place where people don't ask too many questions. It sounded fair enough. I told him to come by Thursday evening. He showed up on a Thursday when the rain had turned to drizzle, the kind that makes everything look soft and slightly out of focus. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a dark hoodie and carrying a backpack that looked like it had been places. He was polite, quiet, almost cautious. "You must be Helen," he said, shaking my hand like someone testing the temperature of water. His palm was cold. He wasn't what I expected. Most of the people who'd messaged me sounded like students or couples fighting for rent control. Ethan looked older than 31, not in a tired way, but in that way people get when they've been keeping themselves alive without help for too long. He didn't waste words. I showed him the space upstairs, pointing out the basics. Small fridge, working heater, fresh sheets. He nodded, asked about parking, and that was it. When I told him the rent and terms, he said, "That's fair," and pulled a folded envelope from his pocket. "First and last month," he added. I hadn't asked for that yet. I told him he could move in on Sunday. He thanked me, then asked, You mind if I bring my own coffee maker? Of course not, I said, a little too quickly. After he left, I stood at the window watching him walk down the street. Steady, deliberate steps, like he was measuring each one. Daisy barked once and then went quiet. I didn't tell Mark that someone had taken the room. I told myself it wasn't important enough to mention. By Sunday afternoon, the upstairs had new sounds. Boxes sliding, footsteps crossing back and forth, the faint rattle of drawers. Daisy kept pausing by the stairs, unsure whether to growl or wag her tail. I told her it was fine. He's just renting, I said aloud, as if explaining it to both of us. For the first few days, we barely spoke. He left early, came home late, and always moved quietly, like he was trying not to disturb something fragile. I appreciated that. On Wednesday, he helped me carry groceries inside without being asked. He just appeared at the door, took half the bags, and nodded toward Daisy. She's friendly, he said. Most dogs bark when they don't like the energy. I smiled. She likes people who don't rush. He didn't answer, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch like he was holding back a smile. That was the first time I noticed his eyes. Gray, sharp, the kind that catch on details. He didn't stare. He studied. Over the next week, he started blending into the edges of my days. A coffee mug left on the counter that wasn't mine, a jacket on the chair, the smell of his soap in the upstairs hallway when I went up to check the smoke alarms. None of it was intrusive, just there. One evening, I came home to find him in the driveway, crouched beside the front door with a screwdriver. Your lock sticks, he said. You should probably get it replaced. I've been meaning to, I said, watching him work. His hands were rough, steady. When the door finally clicked open, I laughed. Guess I needed a tenant/handyman. He smiled without looking up. Guess so. Something about the moment felt oddly natural, like we'd known each other longer than a few weeks. I caught myself watching him longer than necessary, then turned away before he noticed. Later that night, Mark called from Brussels. He was at a bar with colleagues, the noise behind him too loud to make out half the words. Everything running smoothly back home? He asked. Perfectly, I said. House works like a clock. It was the first time I lied to him outright. When I hung up, I sat on the couch and listened. Upstairs, I heard a soft thud, maybe a drawer closing, maybe footsteps. It didn't matter. The house felt different now. Less empty, but not exactly fuller either. Just changed. I told myself it was temporary, just someone renting a space. But I also knew, deep down, that small decisions have a way of growing teeth when you stop paying attention. A week passed quietly enough to seem normal. Ethan and I crossed paths in small ways. The sound of his boots in the hallway, the smell of coffee that wasn't mine, the click of the back door late at night. Sometimes we talked, short conversations about weather or traffic, or the absurdity of grocery prices. It felt easy, even comfortable, which should have been my first warning sign. One evening, a storm cut the power. It happened just after dinner, with a heavy crack outside that made Daisy bark once before settling under the table. I grabbed a flashlight, but Ethan was already on the stairs, holding a lighter. I've got candles, he said, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. We stood in the kitchen, a small flame between us. The light shifted across his face, softer than I'd ever seen it. When his hand brushed mine, it wasn't deliberate, just a reach for the same matchbox. But the air changed. It wasn't about romance, it was recognition. Something in both of us understood we'd been edging toward this line without saying it aloud. I stepped back first. I'll check the breaker, I said, but my voice came out lower than I expected. He nodded, eyes steady. Sure. The lights came back 20 minutes later. I poured myself a glass of wine and pretended that everything was fine. It wasn't dramatic. There was no rush of guilt or thrill. Just an awareness that something irreversible had happened, and it hadn't even needed a kiss. 2 days later, Mark called. The time difference made it morning there, night here. He was sitting by a window, showing me a new apartment he'd rented near the office. I want you to see this, he said, turning the camera. It's got 2 bedrooms. I thought maybe you'd... I can't leave work right now, I interrupted. They're short-staffed. He frowned. Helen, we've been apart for almost 2 years. This isn't what we planned. I know, I said. My throat felt tight. Let's talk about it later. He nodded slowly, like someone realizing a promise had expired. Okay, later, then. When the call ended, I sat for a long time before going to the kitchen. Ethan was there, unpacking takeout boxes. Didn't mean to intrude, he said. You're not, I answered, though I didn't know if that was true. We ate on opposite sides of the counter, plastic forks clinking against the containers. He told me about his delivery routes, how he'd learned the city through back alleys and gas stations. I told him about my design clients who couldn't decide between beige and slightly darker beige. He laughed quietly, a real laugh this time, and I found myself wanting to hear it again. When I went to put the leftovers away, he stood beside me, close enough that I could smell his soap. Clean, ordinary, human. I turned toward him without thinking. We didn't speak. I just leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't cinematic. No music, no pause, just two people who'd run out of ways to pretend. He froze for a second, then kissed me back, slow and uncertain, like he wasn't sure I'd let him. Afterward, we didn't talk about it. He went upstairs, and I washed the dishes until the water turned cold. I told myself it was a mistake, one I wouldn't repeat. But by the next evening, I was waiting to hear his footsteps again. That night, when Mark sent a message, "Good night, love you," I stared at the screen too long before replying. You too. The words felt like someone else had typed them. By the end of that week, the boundaries we'd built stopped holding. Ethan started coming downstairs without knocking. He'd bring coffee or dinner he'd picked up on his route, or just himself with some excuse. Thought you might need help fixing that drawer, or I've got leftovers. I stopped pretending it bothered me. We fell into a rhythm that wasn't quite a relationship, but wasn't distance either. At night, he'd come down after I turned off the lights. No words, no plans, just the quiet sound of the stairs, the shift of weight on the floorboards, the touch that said everything we didn't. By morning, we were strangers again. I'd make 2 mugs of coffee, set one on the counter, and he'd take it without a word before heading out the door. It was messy, but it worked, until it didn't. One evening, I came home to find him already in the kitchen. My phone was on the counter, screen lit up with an incoming call. Mark. Before I could move, Ethan picked it up. Hello? His tone was calm. Sorry, Helen's in the shower. He handed me the phone after hanging up. He said he'll call back. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. You shouldn't have answered, I said. He met my eyes. I know. But I did. Something in his look made my stomach twist. Not guilt, not apology, possession. Like he claimed a part of my life without asking. What the hell does that mean? I asked. It means, he said quietly, you keep pretending you're fine, but you're not. You want someone to notice you exist, and then you panic when they do. I laughed once, sharp. And you? You hide behind other people's houses because you can't stand being alone. He didn't shout. He just nodded like he'd expected it. Maybe, he said, and left. The door closed hard. Daisy flinched. He didn't come back that night, or the next. The house went back to its old rhythm, too quiet, too neat, the air flat again. I told myself it was better this way, that whatever had started between us was always going to end, but I still caught myself glancing at the stairs when I heard a sound, thinking maybe it was him. By the 3rd day, I gave up, pretending not to care. His shoes were still by the door. His jacket still hung on the hook. The coffee mug he always used sat by the sink, half rinsed, like he'd meant to come back. That Saturday, Mark called. I didn't answer. I sat on the porch instead, watching the neighbors' kids play basketball in the rain. Daisy pressed against my leg, restless, sensing something I didn't want to name. When I finally checked my phone, there was a message from Mark, thinking of flying home soon. Surprise visit. I read it twice, my chest tightening in that old familiar way. Relief and dread wrapped together. I looked at the house, at the small window upstairs, still glowing faintly, and realized I didn't even know what home meant anymore. That night, I went to bed early, pretending sleep would solve it. It didn't. The stairs stayed empty, the air stayed still. On Sunday morning, I woke to the sound of a car in the driveway. I thought for a second that it was Ethan, but it wasn't. It was Mark. It was just after 9 when I heard the car door close. I was still in my robe, hair damp, a half-finished glass of wine on the counter from the night before. Daisy barked once, ran to the window, and then there he was, Mark, standing in the drizzle with a suitcase and that look of polite exhaustion he always wore after long flights. "Surprise," he said, smiling like it was still our thing. I forced a smile back and stepped aside. His coat was cold and wet when he hugged me. For a second, I wanted to sink into it. The smell of his cologne, the weight of something familiar. But it felt foreign, like trying on a jacket that doesn't fit anymore. He started unpacking his usual warmth into the room. Small jokes, a few travel stories, an awkward compliment about my haircut. I laughed in the right places, poured him coffee, and kept my eyes on the table. Everything was holding barely. Then I heard it. The sound of a door upstairs. A slow, unmistakable click. Mark froze for half a second before pretending he hadn't heard. "Still renting the top floor?" he asked casually, reaching for his mug. "Yes," I said. My throat felt dry. He just got back. A moment later, Ethan's footsteps reached the stairs. I didn't even have time to think. He walked into the kitchen, paused when he saw Mark, and nodded politely. "Morning," he said, voice steady. Mark looked at him with a professional sort of curiosity, like he was assessing a structural flaw in a bridge. "You must be the tenant." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Just got in from a long shift." I could feel the air shift between them. Quiet, careful, sharp around the edges. I tried to break it. "We were just about to start breakfast," I said too brightly. "You can join us if you want." To my horror, Ethan nodded. "Sure." The three of us sat around the table, pretending to be people with nothing to hide. Mark asked about work. Ethan answered in short, neutral sentences. I passed plates and kept my hands from shaking. Daisy lay under the table, restless, picking up what we were all too polite to say. At one point, Mark said, "It's good to see the house still has life in it." Ethan's fork paused midair. "Yeah," he said quietly, "feels like it." No one spoke after that. When the dishes were cleared, Mark excused himself to take a nap. He kissed my cheek before heading upstairs, not affectionately, just out of habit. The sound of the guest room door closing made my shoulders drop in relief and shame at the same time. Ethan was still standing by the sink. "That was something," he said finally. "Yeah," I whispered. He studied me for a long moment, then asked, "You gonna tell him?" I met his eyes. "Tell him what?" "That I don't even know what I want anymore?" He nodded once. "Then I guess that's your answer." He turned and went upstairs without another word. The rest of the day crawled by. Mark woke from his nap and pretended nothing was strange. We watched TV, made small talk, laughed a little. He didn't mention Ethan again. I didn't either. The next morning, he was dressed and packed before sunrise. "I knew there was something between you two," he said quietly. "But honestly, Helen, it's easier for me to pretend there isn't." He kissed my forehead and walked out the door. No yelling, no scene, just calm surrender. I stood there until I heard his car fade down the street. Ethan came down a few minutes later, silent, eyes on the floor. He looked at me the way people look at a cracked window, something that once worked, now just letting the cold in. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just betrayed a person. I'd betrayed the version of myself who still believed in being steady. After Mark left, the house didn't go quiet. It just shifted tone. There was still movement, still sound, but everything felt out of rhythm. Ethan started staying downstairs more often, as if my kitchen had become neutral ground. I didn't ask him to, and I didn't tell him to stop. At first, it almost worked. We fell into something that looked like routine, dinners that turned into nights together, mornings that turned into half conversations over coffee. It wasn't romance, it was maintenance, a way to avoid the echo of everything that had just fallen apart. But The longer it went on, the more it demanded space. Ethan wanted more than I could give. He never said it outright, but I felt it in the way he lingered in doorways, in the way he looked at the upstairs window when we talked about next week. One night, while I was paying bills at the table, he said, "You could just stop pretending it's temporary." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "You make it sound like it's just filling time." I forced a small laugh. "Isn't that what we're both doing?" He didn't smile. Not anymore. That conversation hung in the air for days. He started coming home later, not telling me where he'd been. I didn't ask, but I noticed the different shampoo scent, the faint trace of someone else's perfume on his jacket. It hit harder than I expected. A week later, he told me himself. We were sitting on the back steps, Daisy asleep at our feet. He said it quietly, like someone giving bad news they'd already rehearsed. "There's someone I see sometimes. A woman from work. She's got her own mess, but at least she doesn't pretend it's not there." I stared straight ahead. "And you're telling me this because you're not mine," he said, "and I'm tired of being your secret basement." The honesty burned more than any accusation. I didn't want to hear it, but I'd run out of ways to deflect. Something snapped. I stood up and slapped him. Not hard, but enough to make my hand sting. He didn't react, just blinked, then looked away. "I'm sorry," I said immediately, though I wasn't sure for what. He nodded once. "No, you're not. You just hate being seen." He went upstairs. The sound of his footsteps faded, then stopped. That night, I sat at the table, staring at my phone for an hour before typing a message to Mark. Maybe I should come to Brussels after all. The reply came faster than I expected. "If that's what you want. But don't rush. I'm not sure it matters anymore." I read it again and again, the words flattening each time. The strange part wasn't his indifference. It was how calm it made me feel. I closed my phone and looked around the room. The leftover takeout, the chipped plate, Daisy sleeping by the heater. Everything was still here, but none of it belonged to anything anymore. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't fighting for love. I was just fighting not to be forgotten. A month later, Ethan moved out. No big goodbye, no speech, just boxes carried quietly down the stairs on a Sunday morning. Daisy watched from the doorway, her head tilted, as if even she expected him to come back for one more trip. He didn't. After the sound of his car faded down the street, the house settled into a silence that wasn't quite relief and wasn't grief either, just space. I went upstairs a few days later to clean. His mug was still by the sink, a few coins left on the windowsill, a forgotten t-shirt folded on the bed. Nothing sentimental, nothing dramatic, just proof that someone had once existed there. I tossed the shirt into a donation box and stood by the window for a while. The yard below looked the same as always. Patchy grass, a tilted mailbox, Daisy sniffing at the fence. Everything had survived the storm of us. A week after that, Mark called. He didn't sound angry or sad, just done. "I think it's better if we stop pretending," he said. "There's someone I've been seeing here. It's easy. In a way, things stopped being for us." I waited for the sting that should have come. It didn't. "I'm glad you told me," I said, and I meant it. He sighed, a sound I'd known half my life. "Take care of yourself, Helen." "You too," I said, and hung up. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the kitchen floor with Daisy's head in my lap. There were no tears, just the low hum of the fridge, the sound of the house remembering its old rhythm. I thought about how everything had unfolded, the choices that felt small until they weren't, the way love can decay, not from cruelty, but from absence. The next morning, I noticed the crack in the kitchen tile again, the one Ethan had promised to fix. I knelt down and touched it, tracing the uneven line. It hadn't gotten worse, but it hadn't healed either. It just stayed there, visible and real. That evening, I took Daisy for a walk around the block. A neighbor waved from her porch. Someone's kid rode a scooter down the sidewalk, laughing. Life had gone on while I'd been somewhere else entirely. When I came home, the house was dark except for the small light I always left on by the stairs. I made tea, sat at the table, and listened to nothing in particular. Sometimes when the floors creak, I think of Ethan, the way he'd pause halfway down the steps, the weight of him there. But it's not longing anymore. It's just memory doing what it does, keeping things alive long enough to understand them. I used to think endings came with noise, slammed doors, raised voices, a final word. Turns out they don't. They just arrive one quiet morning when you realize no one's coming back and you're still standing somehow with your dog, your cracked tile, and your own name that finally sounds like yours again. I got up, washed the mug he'd left behind, and put it in the cabinet with mine. Then I turned off the light.